Hi, this is Elizabeth Ramsey with Instruction Partners, and we are continuing our Rethinking Intervention series today. Today we have José Guadarrama, who is a content lead at FirstLine Schools in New Orleans with us. Thank you so much for talking to me today, José.
Thank you for the invitation.
Great. So we wanted to start off with just hearing about a student's story. I like to always ground in the student perspective. So if you could just tell us about a student that you have worked with and a story of that student that informs your perspective about what the work is of accelerating student learning.
Sure. Thank you for that first question. I have been teaching in New Orleans for 10 years or so. So this was really fun. This is a really fun question. And I really kind of traveled back kind of like 10 years ago and thought about the student Timothy when I worked with him as a third grader. Timothy had an incredible amount of kindness and integrity for an 8-year-old. He had a family and a personal investment for learning that was just remarkable. He was like very personable. He had strong relationships with peers and with adults. And I think one of the things I most remember about Timothy is that he had such a clear growth mindset about himself and about others. When we started third grade together, we were as a school using kind of a guided reading approach to reading instruction. And so he began a year kind of at a first grade reading level. And I really was really concerned because he was beginning the year a couple years behind, almost a couple years behind. And I think it's important to have some context of the school. As a school, we were kind of a new charter. We had new leaders. We were very hungry to learn. We had school goals that were really anchored by the progression or in guided reading. Our interventions were really based on like the pace and rate at which students progressed in the guided reading. Students' reading gaps were articulated using the guided reading program. I think you kind of see where I'm going here. And so like overall, our theory around reading, the development of skilled reading was based on guided reading, which wasn't research-based. And because of that, like the entire kind of school system was approaching this development of reading that really doesn't have, we now know, a strong ground to stand on. Mm-hmm. And I think in a lot of ways, it kind of reflected an incomplete understanding of how skilled reading is developed. And so to come back to Tim, Tim's experience in third grade, he early on was designated as a student that was tier 3, which meant that he was going to receive a lot of support, more time with teachers, small group instruction, good teaching practices like scaffolded questions during whole group. But I think most particularly that kind of stands out is that his intervention experience was designated by his tier, not necessarily by like the skill gaps that he had, right? And so to kind of like think forward a year and kind of look where Tim ended the third grade experience, he actually made a lot of growth. He made a year and a half of growth, but I think that the growth is really reflective of quick wins, right? Like Tim memorized words. He didn't really learn how to decode. And so I come to that anecdote because though his experience was 10 years ago, I do think it serves as an anecdote that captures most of our schools where they are in terms of attending to finish learning when it comes to reading. Our intervention is is predicated on a unclear or kind of fully unrealized theory of action in terms of how skilled reading is developed. And consequently, our interventions kind of match that. And in a lot of times, additionally, like the interventions are kind of like paint by numbers, right? Like if you're tier 2, you receive this intervention and these supports. If you're tier 3, you receive these supports and these interventions. And they don't really drive towards like a clear purpose in a systematic way. And so I think where I'm coming to, especially within the last couple of years, is that I know in order to resolve unfinished learning, we need to work towards a clear purpose in terms of like, what reading is, and then we need to know how to arrive at that purpose in a systematic way. To understand the purpose, again, we need to understand, what skill reading is, and then to move systematically, we need to understand like that developmental pathway, and make sure that those two things are clear to every person in the building, so that when we are approaching unfinished learning, we're approaching in a like cohesive way and aligned way.
That was beautiful. I am like on one about this right now, and so it's exciting to hear it articulated in a student experience. What you're saying about like so much of the research that I have seen that's out there is on structures for accelerating student learning, and what you're saying about like speaking to tiers really shows up, right? Like do this based on tier, but very frequently the structure guidance, this teacher to student ratio, this amount of time, is given removed the content. Like this is how the content discipline works, and therefore this is how intervention should work. And I feel like it's particularly complex in reading, where
Yes.
the assessment landscape is just incredibly tricky. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom there, and also sharing a vulnerable story about something that you think could be improved, because we are all trying in this together and figure it out together. So thinking about this fall, we are in a unique time in many ways. I'd love to hear what you see as the key challenges that teachers need to be prepared for this fall.
Mm-hmm. I think first, developing strong partnerships with families, with colleagues, with school leaders, because this is a turbulent time. And I feel like a deep sense of pride in our approach to distance learning in New Orleans and in FirstLine. And I think part of that pride is contingent on not losing sight of what is actually going on. And the truth is that we are all in, like, though we're virtually connected, like I feel disconnected about the experience of all of my teachers, of all of my leaders, and like how they're showing up every day. And to ask folks to show up on the screen or on the phone with learning materials in front of them, and turning a blind eye to the reality that is this pandemic, I think is something that we have not done, right? Like we are acknowledging kind of this the pandemic and COVID, and it's impacting people in different ways. And so I think the first challenge is not losing sight of that we are in this incredible time as people, and that our job is to educate people, but our job primarily is to make sure that we are keeping each other safe. And a part of that is not only being prepared to teach, but also being prepared to like learn more about who is receiving, like who's in that relationship.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a big challenge, because we can often just kind of forget that. I think the second piece would be is because the learning and teaching context is so different. I think that in these partnerships with families, with colleagues, with school leaders, with across schools, we need to clearly define what learning is. I think one thing that I've been really excited about is when I'm in classrooms with teachers, I've like never seen so many student families. And like they're in there and like they're helping their kid, their scholar, like do the work. And often I'm like, oh no, let them do that. Families are so like, they don't want their child to fail regardless of what's going on in the world. And that to me just like gives me a piece of data that we might not have a shared understanding of what learning is, right? Like learning is an iterative process. Learning means that a student will not be successful the first time, the second time, or the third time, and that's okay. And so how are we talking about learning with like among teachers, among families, so that when a family member sees their child not apply a skill the first time that they've learned it, we say that is okay. And how do we make sure that we frame learning as almost like a metacognitive process of being aware of, oh, this is how I made the mistake, and this is like where I need to be, and like that kind of like analysis of the dissonance, I guess, is like where like the learning really holds, right? And I think that there's an opportunity to kind of again develop a shared understanding of what learning is and what it isn't. It isn't answer getting. So then what is it, I also think that, and again, I think that students are kind of leading us in understanding and what engagement looks like. And we need to really like lean into that, right? I think as a teacher, I see myself as kind of this, I definitely have like um, the knowledge, and I have some knowledge and some experience and some skill to like facilitate the learning in the class that I feel pretty confident in, but also we need to see students as teaching us what they need in terms of like how to be engaged in this kind of like virtual distant context. So that we can really, again, get to the work of learning however that is defined. I think that we need to, another challenge is that we need to continue to develop a deep understanding of content, because in the end, like, though, learning is kind of like this metacognitive process around like, and it's not answer getting, etc. Then like, what is it when we like look at the standards, right? And like the standards clearly define the skills and knowledge aspects. And so as teachers and school leaders, we need to make sure that we're continuing to develop our understanding of what those things are, so that we are communicating that to like parents or family members and students. And that again, like just differs by grade, right? Like in kindergarten and first grade, like families need to know that, like, when I'm reading this book out loud, this is something that I don't necessarily need student to read because it contains words that they haven't been taught how to read yet, and that is okay. But when we're reading this decodable, like that's where we really want to make sure that the kid's brain is sweating, and like how do we know that as like imagine being a first year teacher coming into 2001 school year, and like you need to know that, right? You need to know that if we're in brick and mortar, but like even now, like even more so, right? You need to know that so you can clearly communicate that to students and to families. And again, in grades 2, 3, 4, that just means something different. And so I think kind of just to return to like the challenge, like I think again, like I think the first one is again establishing those strong partnerships across like with colleagues and peers and families and leaders, and like really contextualize where we are in the world. We are in this like unique time, but also continue to learn how to engage students and continue to develop that deep sense of content, so that when we talk about learning, we're not only acknowledging the difference in terms of the virtual or distant learning context, but also like what remains to be true, because the standards kind of tell us what remains to be true.
Oh, I love those points around like what still holds as critical. That's always been critical, just taking new shape during this time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's interesting, it's great to get your perspective too on some of our youngest learners, because I know that has been a large topic of conversation in K2, especially with coming back to school. So in thinking about the fall, we have this challenge around accelerating learning and what that means, which, many argue has always been a challenge. It's just exacerbated during this time. What do you think the best practices are here? Like, what have you seen that works that schools and teachers should be thinking about?
I thought about like moments. I think about moments where I kind of did the best work here. And it really, I think, was contingent on me being a really strong team member. And so, I remember there was a time where we really valued before school started. As a third grade teacher, I would need to connect with my second grade teachers, and like not only learn, the major work of a grade, so to speak,
Right.
but then also learn at a very granular context, where students were coming into my grade from second grade. And what I learned through that process, and with the second grade team, what we kind of taught each other that process is there were some really critical things in second grade that connected to the third grade experience. And there are some things that frankly were kind of like unique to K2. And that helped us both understand better the work that we were doing that year. Now, I did the same thing with my third graders that were going to fourth grade, right? And I think that helped draw the parameters, like clear, bright lines around like again, to borrow this term from math, right, the major work of third grade. And then really kind of like around that, understand like when I think about unfinished learning, I have tighter parameters. Because, you know, when I'm thinking about students like Timothy that may be a couple years behind entering third grade, there's some things in first or second grade that I'm just like not going to prioritize for Tim, because that's not necessarily going to help him access the content in third grade or in fourth grade. And so I think that when thinking about accelerating learning, I also think about, you know, making sure we get really granular about what learning means in particular grade levels and how that learning is set up by the previous grade and where it's waiting for the grade to come, so that that teacher that is receiving students that, you know, in third grade, for example, like knows exactly, or knows with more clarity, I should say, you know, how to use the curriculum and how to like leverage partnerships to intervene, so that good learning and achievement happens.
Have you been thinking about knowledge building here too? Because I think there's the precision element, and I love that because prioritization is possible, and it's important to think about it that way. How are you thinking about knowledge building in elementary reading?
When you say knowledge building, do you mean like building background knowledge and accessing complex texts?
Yes. Yeah. Just like, because I know that some curriculum have a aligned vertical scope and sequence of knowledge. Some folks do that differently, and that's been put forth as one of the key strategies to make sure we're really focusing on during this time. Just wanted to hear your thoughts there.
Sure. I mean, I think this kind of comes back to like the initial question around like how is skilled reading developed, right? And I think a part of what needs to be learned from like a teacher perspective, but also exercised throughout the year, is that it's not just decoding in K2, right? Like we know that students are able to like comprehend and discuss complex texts, but they're not able to read it independently. And that has a place when thinking about the development of skilled reading, right? Like I think about that simple view kind of like mathematic equation. I'm talking a lot about math today, but like right, the simple view premise that, you know, decoding it multiplied by language comprehension equals reading comprehension. And so as a K2 teacher, like where does knowledge building fit there? It's in the language comprehension piece, right? And we need to make sure that though the you know, standards ask for the foundational skills standards to be mastered in the K1 band, that doesn't mean that there aren't informational and literary standards, because those attend to different muscles in a reader's brain that are necessary in order for skilled reading to be developed, right? Like in order for third grader or a second grader to enter at grade level, they need to have had those knowledge based read alouds, so that they can access the content in the grade that they're coming into.
Right.
So I guess in some, I'm saying like, sorry, in some,
yeah.
You know, I feel like I got a little convoluted. I think it really just hangs on the degree to which a teacher is understanding like what skilled reading is, how it's developed, like in a almost like theoretical sense, and like and then how does the curriculum, or excuse me, how does the reading program at this school fit there, so I can see how each part of the reading experience in a student's day like contributes to that overall belief.
That's great. Thank you. And not convoluted, very helpful. And so the flip side of that question is, what have you seen that doesn't work in accelerating learning? And what are the things that either give you pause or nervousness about next year that you want to see folks avoid?
I think that what I'm seeing now and hearing are things that I thought we had left behind. Things like skills chasing, right? So when thinking about third and fourth grade, for example, I'm hearing like, how are we going to reteach character motivations when at the exit ticket level, a student has demonstrated that they don't yet understand how a character's motivations contribute to the sequence of events? I'm not trying to downplay the importance of data or even the importance of reteaching. What I'm wanting to make sure we're avoiding is this kind of standards chasing aspect. And as opposed to taking a step back and seeing kind of this multi variable equation at work. That character motivation lesson is but one variable in a larger experience a student is having in terms of their reading development. And so as I ask that character motivation question in terms of the exit ticket level, how else am I stepping back to see like the other components that in that like together will actually give me a more accurate picture of the degree to which a reader is developing within a year. And so I think that, again, this like skills chasing piece, I think, is something that I would like us to kind of put to rest. I also am getting a sense that we're definitely like wanting to make sure that we're maximizing our beginning of year assessments, our like screeners, and our diagnostic assessments, which I think is great. I think that we have much work to do there. A big challenge I think that we need to attend to is be able to answer the degree to which these assessments are inform instructional pivots.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is when a student in the beginning of the year takes a MAP assessment, I really respect the data that MAP assessment gives, right? It gives data based on national norms. Like you can get really granular with this data. It's a strong assessment. However, to what degree as a teacher am I using that data to plan my next day's lesson? Should I be? Like having clear, the answer for me is no. But the degree to which a teacher is hearing that across all levels, like does a school leader know how to say that? Does a school director, does a chief academic officer like understand the kind of like place and purpose of those beginning of year assessments? And so again, like I think that having like it's great that we're wanting to maximize our beginning of year assessment data, but making sure that we completely understand the purpose of those assessments and the limits of them, right? So that we don't then unfortunately like overload teachers with a lot of data that isn't necessarily actionable on a day-to-day.
Mm-hmm. Love that. And this is just, your perspective has been invaluable, and I'm so grateful for your time. Is there anything else that you just want to leave us with, or leave teachers and leaders with to think about this fall?
Only that, we're moving forward in these unprecedented times, and the way that we've come together to collaborate on behalf of our students is incredible. And that we should always start with that in mind, right? Like whenever we begin the work, like we always need to have our students at the center and allow for this, like answering like what is going to be the best student experience to get them ready for the next year, to like treat them as a whole person, should always be where we begin conversations and like where we end them.
Love that. Thank you so much, Jose. Hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Elizabeth.